1 year since I got the A7S III, 1 year since it came out at the time of recording this video, and I want to share with you all of my thoughts, experiences, any issues I've had with it since I got it a year ago. Don't think of this as a review. If you want that, click on my previous video up there. This is real-world usage feedback using this for a year in no particular order. We'll start with the flip screen. Now, I absolutely love the flip screen on the A7S III. I'm so glad we have a full-frame camera with a flip screen. However, mine became loose after about 9 or 10 months to the point where I could hold it like this, shake it, and you'd see it wobbling around there, which isn't good. I sent mine away to get repaired by Sony, and it was covered under warranty. If yours is loose or wobbly and you're still in warranty, I'd highly recommend you send yours away to get repaired too. Now, moving on from the flip screen, I love the touchscreen aspect of the flip screen for focusing and tracking. I will say though that I don't really use it for the menus anymore. I find it easier to navigate with the joystick or the D-pad. Up until I was writing on my notes here, I literally forgot that you can actually use the touchscreen for going through the menus. I think it's quicker not to use the touchscreen and just use the D-pad because that's what you're used to. You might be different, but for me, it's the most efficient way. With that said, let's talk about the menus, which got changed dramatically with the A7S III, and they are so much better than the older menus that we had before. I was very used to using those old menus, but now I feel like a wizard with the new menus. When I think of a setting, I know exactly where it is, I know exactly where to scroll to. The new menus are very welcome, and I hope we have them on all future cameras, please, Sony. Let's talk about custom buttons. Now, I don't actually really use the custom buttons on this very much anymore. I find myself using the quick menu, the FN function menu. I almost entirely relied on custom buttons to control the A7 III. Now I just use the function menu. So it's funny how your workflows change with different cameras. I just find this easier, and I have access to more things there. Like, I don't have that many custom buttons on the camera, so I can fit more things in there. Maybe I'm just using the camera a little bit more than I was with the A7 III. Let's talk about the screen quality. Now, on the A7S III, it was a dramatic improvement over the A7 III. Now, I know we can't really compare those cameras, but that's what I had before, the A7 III. The screen quality was awful. We got a big improvement on the A7S III. It's over 1 million dots now, but it still feels a little bit lackluster. There's no magic to it, and video just looks very kind of meh when you look back at it on the camera itself. Once you put that onto a big screen, it's almost like watching completely different video. That's where your video comes alive, on a bigger screen, not on the back of the camera. Compare that to something like the EOS R, where you see the magic of what you shot literally on the back of the screen. I'd love to see Sony put more effort into screens moving forwards. The EOS R has been out, 3 years now, and that's 2-point-something million dots. It's nearly double the A7S III screen. Even on the A1, which is Sony's flagship top-of-the-range camera, it's still the same screen that we have on this. It's just not that high res. The EVF, on the other hand, is a completely different story. It's better than anything I've ever used before. It's beautiful to look through. It's like the perfect resolution. I couldn't ask for a better EVF, if I'm honest. Weather sealing. Now, I've been in some serious rain with the A7S III. It's got very, very wet, and there's been a few times where I've been somewhat worried, and I haven't had one issue with it. And that's with the hot shoe uncovered there. Now, I know Matt, who is Matt Johnson, has had an issue recently with his A7S III and rain getting in there, and it can cause problems if you get water on the contacts there. Can't say I've had any issues like that, and I've definitely had that very, very wet. So happy to report no issues with weather sealing on the A7S III. I've had no issues with write speeds on memory cards. I've had no lag with the camera. I've had no freezing, no memory card issues. It's done everything I've asked it to do perfectly. I do really enjoy using the grip on this. It's fantastic. I'm very, very happy with the little design change that they made. If you're someone that values grip, you will really like this. That being said, I do prefer the grip on the FX3. 60 frames per second, 4K video. It's absolutely insane. I'd never used 4K 60 or 120 before owning this camera, and now I shoot it for a lot of stuff. All my B-roll is shot in 4K 60. I shoot most weddings entirely in 4K 60. Literally game-changing for me. I actually started using 4K 120 when I very first got this, but I stopped after a while because I didn't need it. And also I use the active stabilization nearly all the time, and it's disabled when you're in 4K 120. We'll talk more about stabilization in a bit. I still don't like this push to turn dial on here. I'm not a fan of it. Like, having to use 3 fingers basically, or 2 fingers at a push to control that dial there, I don't like it. I would have preferred something like this where you push it once, you can turn it, push it again, and it locks it. That is a better design than this is. Speaking of which, the exposure compensation on the A7S III, I don't really feel like it was necessary. I think that could have been used for something else. Can't be the only one that thinks that. The autofocus is ridiculously good. The tracking is fantastic. I can't think of any times off the top of my head where it's failed. That box that you tap on and it just tracks things, it just sticks to it like glue. It's it's magic. I can rely on the autofocus of this camera so heavily for this kind of video, for other YouTube videos that I shoot, the different styles that I shoot, for weddings, for real estate. I turn on autofocus, I let it do its thing, and I can trust it. And that's really nice. I can worry about other things. I like it. All the ports and the flaps and everything like that, perfectly designed here. Nothing interferes with the flip screen if you're shooting yourself. Oh, don't need to record there. Apart from if you have an HDMI cable plugged in, but I'm rarely using HDMI in there while I'm filming myself with the flip screen. I will say that the ports are designed better on this than on the FX3, which came out afterwards. Don't know why. It's kind of odd, but yeah, good job. A7S III ports, perfect. The battery life on the A7S III is good for what it is. The fact that you're shooting 4K 60 and 120. When I first got it coming from the A7 III, I was a little bit disappointed because the batteries do die a lot quicker. But I realized I'm shooting everything in 4K 60, 10-bit 422, so it's doing a lot more. So I've really just gotten used to that. But if you are on longer shoots, you're going to burn through batteries. For a wedding day now, to give you an example, 2 cameras, I can easily get through 7 to 9 batteries on an 8-hour day. Now that would be a cumulative total of about 2.5 to 4 hours of video, everything in 4K 60, 10-bit 422 for reference. That's why I've been loving the Anton Bauer battery base. I'll link that video up there that I talked about before. If you don't know what that is, to sum up in a couple of sentences, think shooting a full day wedding, probably 2 on 1 battery, no battery changes, extra weight added for shooting handheld. It's a good setup. Overheating. So a lot of people were wondering about this when it first came out. I personally haven't had any issues with it. I have mine set to high. It's one of the first things you should change on your camera when you get it. A7S III or FX3, just go in and change it straight to high straight away. I keep going back to weddings as an example, but it is a great example. 4K 60, 10-bit 422 throughout a whole day, ton of shooting. Never even had that little symbol on there to say that the camera's getting hot. I haven't really shot 4K 120 in a long time now, as I mentioned earlier, but when I first got the camera, I was using it. Now, it would definitely get a lot warmer when you're using that, and you'd burn through batteries a lot quicker. And I did have the heat symbol appear on there once after about 40 minutes of non-stop recording B-roll of different things. I'd like shoot for 2 minutes, stop, rearrange some things, shoot for another 2 minutes. And I had the little symbol come up there saying that it was getting warm, but it never turned off. I do miss crop mode hugely for video. Having crop mode and clear image zoom combined just gave me a lot of extra reach that I would constantly use with the A7 III. With the sensor being smaller in the A7S III, you obviously don't have the ability to crop in. For video, you can in photo, and it goes down to, 5 megapixels. But I do miss having crop mode, and I'm looking forward to see what we get in the A7 IV if we can get 4K 60, 10-bit 422, and the ability to have a crop mode with no overheating. That would be pretty good. Let's talk about the stabilization on this camera. I think it's a hugely underrated feature on the A7S III. I shoot a lot of stuff handheld now, and I never did before, and that is because of the active stabilization, and it's so damn useful. I'm talking tripod level for some things. I will keep my arms like tucked in. I can't really show you with the mic here, but tucked in like this, and no word of a lie, it'll look like you're shooting on a tripod. It does such a good job. I literally leave active stabilization on all the time, unless I'm flying it on a gimbal. With the A7 III, I used to use a monopod the entire day, just to have non-shaky shots. But both with the A7S III and the FX3, I haven't once used a monopod in the past year. I'm not happy with it. I'm either now shooting handheld or on a gimbal. Now, as I said, you should turn active stabilization off when you're on a gimbal so it doesn't confuse things a little bit. Just add it in your quick menu and you can quickly turn it on and off. Right, so here's a hot topic. Color science and shooting in log. Now, I want to share my experience as a whole and previous experiences coming from the A7 III to give you a bit of context. I'll talk about log in a second. I never used to shoot in log or HLG with the A7 III. That extra step in workflow for me just wasn't worth it. Most of the work that I do, both on here and client work, is normally in need of being turned around pretty quickly. I rarely had issues with things being blown out. That combined with the fact that it was only 8-bit log, it's not the easiest to grade, it requires perfect exposure, I just steered clear of it. But since getting the A7S III, I've played around with a few different color setups. Firstly, the straight out of the camera color in standard is great on the A7S III. Some huge improvements here from Sony over any previous models that they had. You can shoot in that and get a very good looking image, albeit a bit saturated for my taste, specifically with like greens, but skin tones in general in standard are solid. Another creative look I'm really happy with for things like this is neutral with a few adjustments. This is a bit flatter and less saturated than the baked in standard look. I play around with contrast a little in post, bump the saturation a little bit. Normally it's just one adjustment layer in Final Cut, and that's it, I'm done. I'm talking like a 2-minute fix for color for the whole video. For incredibly quick turnarounds, for things I don't want to look as saturated, I use this a lot for YouTube stuff, in-studio stuff. I'm shooting with it right now. This is what it looks like ungraded. That's with my quick, 2-minute fix on it. Next, we'll talk about S-Cinetone. So a little update we got on the A7S III from Sony mid-year, which I'm happy that they did. I've played around with this a lot, and I've come to a pretty simple conclusion for myself and a rule that I stand by now. I like using S-Cinetone for outdoor video as it's a bit more muted and it's more contrasty. It renders greens a little nicer than in the standard color. But for darker stuff like inside like this, I'm not a fan anymore. I just don't like the look of it for inside darker stuff. That's my personal preference. It might not be yours. Now, with all that said, I've actually been shooting the whole year for weddings in S-Cinetone, and I love how it looks. I think it's like a perfect style, perfect look for weddings. So whole year this year, S-Cinetone for weddings. Now, all of these, standard, neutral, and S-Cinetone, still give you a ton of options for changing colors in the grade if you want to, and that's because of the flexibility of 10-bit color. Just know with 10-bit, you can very easily change colors around, and you have a lot of play. Now, finally, log, which I've played around with all year, but only in the last month or 2 months or so have become a massive, massive fan of. Specifically, S-Log 3, especially when it's super bright outside. It's so easy to use now. There really isn't an excuse not to use it. The learning curve for shooting log on the A7S III is a lot less steep than it was on the A7 III. You've got gamma display assist, which you can turn on. It basically shows you how it's going to look, providing you expose somewhere in plus 1.3 to plus 1.7. That's my personal preference. It looks fantastic. Now, Final Cut actually has a built-in log conversion LUT for the A7S III, which is okay, but I've been playing around with the Phantom LUTs. And let me tell you, Joel's the creator, you have done some stunning work. They're worth every single penny. I think I paid $80 for them, and it was the set of LUTs and then a film set as well. They're beautiful. I absolutely love them. If you try using those, you will not regret it, and you won't want to use anything else, believe me. So S-Log 3 on the A7S III and the FX3 is an absolute must. Also, the low light performance. A7S II was very well known for the low light performance, and this is better than that. I can crank the ISO in a creative look and still get pretty high without noise, but if you do want the best performance, you've got to be shooting an S-Log 3 so you can take advantage of the dual base ISOs, which are 640 and 12,800. So let's talk about file formats. So when I first got the A7S III, I started out shooting with the XAVC SI 4K file format. But after a couple of months of just burning through hard drives, I had to change to the XAVC-S 4K, which means things are a lot smaller and more compressed with a decent amount of data in there still for color grading as it's still 10-bit. But the problem with this is now my workflow is entirely dependent on Proxies on my 2019 iMac, which is pretty specced out still. The editing experience is horrible and constantly freezes with those files. So you have to use Proxies. On my M1 MacBook Pro, no issues in 2460, and even in 120, it's just about usable. But on the iMac, Proxies are required for everything. So now it's a case of copying the files, throwing them into Final Cut, and leaving it until the Proxies and optimized files have been created. Now, I have Final Cut set up to automatically work on these when I import them, but this can take some time, and it's drastically changed my workflow, and it has slowed it down. It also means I can't really use my machine while these are being created, or the Proxies are being created, because it just bogs it down, which is very frustrating. So be prepared to either buy a ton of hard drives or work within a proxy environment. Now, as a stills camera, I think the A7S III is the best value that Sony has to offer right now. And stick with me for a second on that ridiculous statement. If you think about it, what's come out with the same tech or better since this has come out? There's only one camera, the A1, which is $1 million. So to get the latest color, autofocus performance, high frames per second, 9 million EVF, flip screen, and the other tech that Sony has, the next best thing is the A7S III. The only problem being it's 12 megapixels. Now, for someone like me who really only shoots real estate photos, thumbnails, and a few other stills here and there, don't believe the hype surrounding megapixels. 12 megapixels, if it's just going on the internet, is more than enough. Also remember, with more megapixels, so on like the A1 or an R camera, a photo at its highest resolution, you can easily approach 200 megabytes per raw file. So if you shoot 1,000 photos, that's 20 gigs. It's a lot. One thing I actually don't hear people talk about a lot is the shutter sound. I really like it on this. I love using this as a stills camera. That is my main stills camera. This also goes to show us how needed the A7 IV is right now with like the newer color, the improved autofocus, maybe a flip screen. Sony, anytime now. Anytime. Now, we also need to touch on the subject, which is the A7S III versus the FX3. They are the same camera inside. On the outside, they have different bodies, buttons, and the FX3 has some quirks, but they are the same camera. Now, I did a video comparing them before, which you can watch up here, but I'll briefly reiterate my final point from that video. If you're looking at both the A7S III and the FX3 and trying to decide on which to get, if you need to use it for video and a bit of photos, A7S III is absolutely the way to go. The EVF is just ridiculous, as I mentioned before, and for stills, you absolutely need an EVF from a paid work perspective. If you're just going to be using this for video, I'd lean towards the FX3 if you don't need the EVF. It's a better video camera. It's designed better for video with the buttons on there, all the tally lights, etc. I have both, and that's exactly how I use them. If I'm just shooting video for a wedding or a commercial video shoot or something, I'm taking the FX3. If I need to do any form of photos whatsoever, the A7S III is coming with me. So there we go. That's my experiences with the Sony A7S III over the past year. All the good, all the bad. Bad really only just being the flip screen. Yeah. That's that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.